What is she doing here? She has no right.
She stood over his casket in a black dress she had picked out 3 days earlier, her hands trembling as she reached to touch his cold face one final time. Renata Cole had buried men before, her father, her grandmother, even a brother taken too soon, but nothing prepared her for the moment the funeral home doors opened, and a woman she had never seen in her life walked in holding the hand of a teenage boy who had her husband's exact eyes, his exact jawline, his exact walk. The room went silent. Whispers began to ripple through the pews. Renata's sister gripped her arm so tightly it left a mark. And in that single moment, standing over the body of the man she had loved for 18 years, Renata Cole realized she had never truly known her husband at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this woman standing in the back of the funeral home, dressed in grey, refusing to meet anyone's eyes? Why did the teenage boy beside her have Marcus Cole's face carved so precisely onto his own that even strangers in the pews began to turn and stare? And why, 3 days later, would a courtroom full of lawyers reveal a will that would strip away everything Renata thought she owned, everything she thought she had built alongside the man she married? This was not simply a story of infidelity. This was a story of a double life so carefully constructed, so quietly funded, that it would take a grieving widow tearing through bank statements at 2 in the morning to even begin to understand what her husband had truly been hiding for over a decade. To understand how Renata Cole ended up standing in that funeral home, humiliated in front of family, friends, and co-workers, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a spring afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, 19 years earlier, when a 24-year-old nursing student named Renata first met a charming, ambitious young man named Marcus Cole at a mutual friend's cookout. Marcus was magnetic. He had a laugh that filled a room and a way of making everyone around him feel like the most important person in the conversation. He was working 2 jobs at the time, saving toward a business degree, talking constantly about the company he wanted to build one day, a logistics firm that would move freight up and down the East Coast. Renata found his ambition intoxicating. Within a year, they were inseparable. Within 3, they were married in a small church on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by 2 families who believed they were watching the beginning of something solid. Those early years carried a kind of momentum that made everything feel inevitable, as though Renata and Marcus were simply walking a path that had already been laid out for them. Renata finished her nursing degree while Marcus took on odd contracts, hauling freight himself in a second-hand truck before he could afford to hire a single employee. They lived in a cramped 1-bedroom apartment near the hospital where Renata worked, splitting shifts so one of them could always be reachable by phone. Friends remember those years fondly, describing a couple who seemed to genuinely enjoy the grind, who threw modest dinner parties on Sunday afternoons and talked openly about the family and the future they intended to build together. Nobody who knew them then could have imagined the quiet architecture of deception Marcus would eventually construct, because in those early years, by every visible measure, he adored her. For the first several years, their life together looked exactly like the dream they had promised each other. Marcus's business, Cole Freight Solutions, grew steadily. Renata worked long shifts as a labor and delivery nurse while supporting him behind the scenes, managing invoices some nights, calming his nerves before big client meetings, believing every sacrifice was building toward a shared future. They bought a modest brick home in a quiet Charlotte neighborhood. They talked about children, about vacations, about growing old on a porch somewhere near the water. Marcus began traveling more as the company expanded, first once a month, then twice, then almost weekly, always with the same explanation: new clients, new contracts, new cities that needed his attention. Renata never questioned it. Why would she? He always called every night before bed, always sent flowers on their anniversary, always came home a little more tired but never once distant. It was during this period of expansion, according to former employees who spoke about Marcus years later, that Cole Freight Solutions began winning contracts along a corridor stretching from Charlotte down through Columbia and into Savannah, a route Marcus personally insisted on managing himself rather than delegating to his growing staff. At the time, this seemed like simple dedication, the kind of hands-on leadership that had built the company from nothing. Employees recalled him leaving the office energized before those trips, more animated than usual, joking that he simply liked the drive down Interstate 26 because it gave him time to think. Nobody thought to question why a man who complained about exhaustion after local deliveries seemed to find endless energy for a 3-hour drive to Savannah, sometimes twice in a single month, sometimes staying far longer than any client meeting could reasonably require. It was a decade into their marriage that the small inconsistencies began, so small that Renata barely noticed them at the time. A charge on a shared account for a hotel in a city Marcus said he'd never visited. A missed call late one night from a number she didn't recognize, the caller hanging up the moment she answered. A weekend trip, he said, was for a logistics conference that, when she mentioned it casually to one of his business partners, no one seemed to remember scheduling. Each time, Marcus had an explanation ready, smooth and immediate, and each time Renata chose to believe him, because the alternative felt unthinkable, because 18 years of marriage does not prepare a woman to imagine that the man beside her in bed each night might be living an entirely separate life, just a few hours away. Looking back, Renata would later admit to her sister that there had been a particular autumn, nearly 12 years into the marriage, when Marcus seemed to change in ways she chose to explain away rather than confront. He began keeping his phone face down on every surface, a habit he had never had before. He started taking calls in the garage with the door shut, telling her it was simply easier to hear over the noise of the television. He grew short-tempered whenever she asked simple questions about his schedule, snapping in a way that felt entirely unlike the patient man she had married. Renata told herself it was the stress of running a growing business. The pressure of provider expectations, the natural friction that settles into any long marriage. She had no framework at the time, for imagining the truth was so much larger than ordinary marital distance. The trouble that would eventually unravel everything began on an unremarkable Tuesday in October, when Marcus told Renata he had a 3-day trip planned to Savannah for a shipping contract renewal, the kind of trip he had taken dozens of times before without incident. She kissed him goodbye at the door, watched him load his suitcase into the car, and returned to her shift at the hospital, never imagining that conversation would be one of the last real exchanges they would ever share. 2 days later, she received a call no wife is ever prepared for. Marcus had collapsed suddenly at a hotel in Savannah, a massive heart attack, the paramedics said, and by the time they reached him, there was nothing more that could be done. He was 46 years old. The hours immediately following that phone call blurred together for Renata in a way she still struggles to fully recall. She remembers driving to Savannah with her sister behind the wheel because her hands were shaking too badly to hold a steering wheel. She remembers standing in a hospital hallway filling out paperwork with a pen that felt impossibly heavy. She remembers a kind young nurse offering her water she never drank. What she does not remember clearly is the exact moment someone mentioned that Marcus had been staying not at a hotel near his usual client meetings downtown, but at a residential address nearly 15 minutes outside the city centre, a detail that barely registered at the time, but would later become one of the first threads Renata would pull when the full picture began to emerge. Renata flew into a fog of grief so thick she barely remembers making the arrangements, barely remembers choosing the casket, barely remembers calling his mother to deliver the news. What she does remember with painful clarity is a single detail that seemed strange even in the haze of morning. When the coroner's office released Marcus's personal belongings, there was a second cell phone among them, one Renata had never seen in 18 years of marriage, its screen cracked, its battery long dead. She placed it in a drawer without a second thought, too consumed by funeral arrangements to question it, not yet understanding that this small black rectangle held the answer to everything she was about to lose. The days leading up to the funeral passed in a strange, mechanical rhythm, casseroles arriving from neighbors, sympathy cards piling on the kitchen counter, Renata's phone buzzing constantly with condolences from people who had known Marcus for years, and, as it would later turn out, knew almost nothing true about the life he had actually been living. She selected hymns for the service, chose the flowers, wrote an obituary praising a devoted husband and respected businessman, every word of it sincere at the time she wrote it. She had no reason yet to doubt any part of the story she had spent 18 years believing. That certainty would survive exactly until the funeral itself, when a stranger in grey walked through the doors of the church, and everything Renata thought she knew quietly began to collapse. The day of the funeral arrived grey and heavy with rain, family gathering at the small church where Renata and Marcus had married nearly 2 decades earlier. She stood at the front greeting a blur of familiar faces, co-workers from the hospital, old friends from the neighborhood, Marcus's business associates offering quiet condolences. It was nearing the end of the viewing when the doors at the back of the church opened, and a woman none of them recognized stepped inside, dressed modestly in grey, a teenage boy close beside her. The room's energy shifted immediately. Whispers moved through the pews like a current. The boy's face was unmistakable, Marcus's jawline, Marcus's deep-set eyes, Marcus's exact way of holding his shoulders. Renata's sister leaned in and whispered the question everyone was suddenly too afraid to ask aloud. The woman gave her name quietly to the pastor at the door, Yolanda Price. She did not approach the casket. She did not speak to Renata directly. She simply found a seat near the back with her son Malik and sat through the remainder of the service with tears streaming silently down her face, tears that looked far too personal for a stranger paying respects to a business associate. Renata's mind raced through every polite explanation available to her, a distant cousin, an old family friend, anyone but the possibility that had already begun forming, unwelcome and impossible to ignore in the back of her mind. She would not have to wait long for confirmation. 3 days later, a call from an estate attorney would change everything she believed about the life she had built. In the days between the funeral and that fateful call, Renata found herself unable to stop replaying the image of Yolanda and Malik sitting quietly in the back pew, unable to shake the resemblance that had silenced an entire room of mourners. She confided in her sister late one night, admitting a fear she had not spoken aloud even to herself, that somewhere out there existed a version of her marriage she had never been told about. Her sister urged caution, reminding her that grief distorts perception, that there could be 100 innocent explanations. Renata wanted desperately to believe that. She lit a candle at Marcus's photo on the mantel each evening and told herself she was simply exhausted, simply grieving, simply imagining shadows where none existed. The attorney's phone call would end that hope entirely. The attorney's office was small, tucked into a converted house near downtown Charlotte, the kind of place Renata had passed 100 times without ever imagining she would sit inside it grieving and confused. She arrived expecting a routine reading of Marcus's will, assuming she would inherit the home, the modest savings, what remained of Cole Freight Solutions. Instead, she found herself seated 3 chairs away from Yolanda Price and her son Malik, both dressed in the same somber grey from the funeral, both refusing to make eye contact. The attorney cleared his throat, opened a thick folder, and began reading a document that would reveal not one secret, but an entire Second Life Marcus Cole had constructed and maintained for nearly 12 years, funded, the attorney would soon reveal, directly from accounts Renata had spent 2 decades helping to build. According to the will, drafted and notarized 4 years earlier without Renata's knowledge, Marcus had left a Savannah townhouse to Yolanda Price outright, along with a life insurance policy Renata never knew existed, naming Malik as primary beneficiary. But it was the final clause that made the room go still. Buried in a subsection of the estate documents was a 22% ownership stake in Cole Freight Solutions, the very company Renata had helped build from nothing, quietly transferred into Malik's name 3 years prior. Renata sat frozen as the attorney explained that this stake, combined with certain voting provisions Marcus had structured years earlier, meant that a 16-year-old boy she had met for the first time 4 days ago now held enough leverage to influence the future of the business she considered her own. The silence that followed the attorney's reading stretched on long enough that Renata later described it as the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. She remembers looking over at Yolanda, expecting to see triumph or satisfaction, and instead seeing only exhaustion, a woman who looked as though she too had been carrying a weight she never asked for. Malik stared at the floor the entire time, 16 years old and clearly uncomfortable being made a symbol of his father's deception rather than simply a grieving son. Renata realized, even in that first devastating hour, that whatever anger she felt toward Marcus could not simply be redirected wholesale toward the 2 strangers sitting across from her, though it would take considerably longer for that understanding to soften into anything resembling grace. Renata left the attorney's office that afternoon and drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, replaying 18 years of marriage through an entirely new and devastating lens. Every late trip to Savannah, every unexplained charge, every night Marcus came home a little more tired, but insisted nothing was wrong. She thought of the cracked cell phone still sitting in her dresser drawer and understood, for the first time, that it was not a curiosity to be dealt with later. It was evidence. Somewhere inside that phone was the true timeline of her husband's second life, and Renata Cole, exhausted, humiliated, and furious in a way she had never known herself capable of, decided that night that she would not simply mourn what she had lost. She would find out exactly how deep the deception went. It took Renata 3 days to work up the courage to charge the cracked phone, plugging it into an old cord she found in a kitchen drawer, and watching the screen flicker weakly back to life on her dining room table at nearly midnight. No passcode. Marcus had never imagined anyone else would hold this device in their hands. What she found in the following hours emptied something out of her that she would never fully get back. Thousands of text messages spanning 12 years. Photographs of birthdays she never attended, a nursery being painted, a boy's first day of school, a family Christmas with a tree she had never decorated. Marcus had not simply been unfaithful. He had been living an entire second existence in Savannah, one with its own rhythms, its own holidays, its own quiet permanence, while returning to Charlotte and calling it a business trip. Scrolling further back through the messages, Renata found the earliest exchanges between Marcus and Yolanda, dated nearly 13 years prior, tender and ordinary in a way that made her stomach turn. He had told Yolanda in those first messages that he was a widower, that his first wife had died young in a car accident, that he had been lonely for years before meeting her at a logistics conference in Savannah. Renata read those words twice to make sure she understood them correctly. Marcus had not simply hidden his marriage. He had invented an entire fictional tragedy to explain her absence, constructing a fabricated grief that Yolanda had apparently comforted him through for years, never once suspecting that the woman he claimed to have buried was very much alive, working double shifts 90 minutes north, wondering why her husband seemed a little more tired with each passing year. The messages revealed something else, something that turned Renata's grief into a colder, more focused anger. Marcus had not funded this second household from nothing. Buried in the message threads were references to a business account, one Renata had always assumed was strictly for Cole Freight Solutions' operating expenses, being used instead to cover Yolanda's mortgage, Malik's private school tuition, and a steady stream of transfers labelled only with initials Renata didn't recognize. For over a decade, money that should have gone toward growing the company she had sacrificed years of her nursing career to help build had instead quietly funded a second family 90 minutes down the interstate. Renata sat at her dining table until sunrise, the weight of the betrayal settling into something sharper than sadness, something closer to resolve. By morning, Renata had filled 3 notebook pages with dates, transfer amounts, and cross-referenced business trips, laying the foundation for what would become a months-long investigation into exactly how her husband had managed to keep 2 entirely separate financial lives running in parallel, without either woman ever discovering the other. She recognized certain patterns immediately from her own bookkeeping background: transfers timed suspiciously close to major company invoices, expense reports padded just enough to cover the difference. What had once looked like ordinary operating costs now revealed themselves as a carefully maintained second budget, hidden inside the first, sustained for over a decade by a man who apparently possessed a level of organizational discipline in his deception that he rarely showed in any other part of his life. Determined to understand exactly how deep the deception ran, Renata reached out to the company's longtime accountant, a woman named Carla Simmons, who had handled Cole Freight Solutions books for nearly 9 years. What Carla revealed over a quiet, tense lunch meeting stunned her further. Marcus had restructured certain ownership documents nearly 4 years earlier, shortly after a health scare he never mentioned to Renata, a mild cardiac episode that apparently frightened him enough to begin quietly securing Malik's financial future. Carla admitted she had questioned the paperwork at the time, but had been told directly by Marcus that it was a private family matter unrelated to daily operations. Renata realized then that Marcus hadn't simply hidden an affair. He had spent years methodically preparing an exit strategy for a life he intended to keep separate forever. Carla, visibly shaken by her own unwitting role in the deception, pulled additional records over the following days, records that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of premeditation. The health scare 4 years earlier appeared to have triggered a flurry of quiet legal activity, not just the ownership transfer, but the drafting of the life insurance policy, the purchase of the Savannah townhouse under a business entity rather than his own name, and the notarization of the will itself, all completed within an 8-month window. Marcus had apparently kept entirely separate from any conversation with Renata. Carla admitted, with visible guilt, that she had assumed at the time these were standard estate planning measures any successful business owner might take. She had no reason then to suspect an entire hidden family existed on the other end of every transaction she had processed. Just as Renata began to see Marcus as the sole architect of her devastation, a phone call from Yolanda Price complicated the narrative further. Yolanda asked to meet in person, choosing a quiet coffee shop away from both of their homes, and what she revealed reshaped Renata's understanding of the entire situation. Yolanda had not known, for the first several years, that Marcus was married. He had told her he was widowed, presenting photographs of a fabricated late wife, maintaining the lie so convincingly that Yolanda only discovered the truth when Malik was already 7 years old. By then, she explained through tears, she felt trapped, financially dependent, raising a son who adored a father who was never fully present, unwilling to shatter Malik's world by exposing a truth she herself had only recently uncovered. Yolanda described the moment she discovered the truth in halting, painful detail, recalling how she had found a photograph in Marcus's wallet, not of the fictional late wife he had described, but of a smiling woman in nursing scrubs standing beside him at what was unmistakably a wedding, a photograph dated only 2 years earlier. She confronted him that night, she said, expecting him to end things immediately, expecting the relationship to collapse under the weight of her discovery. Instead, Marcus had wept, begged for understanding, insisted that his marriage to Renata had grown cold and distant years earlier, that he was already planning to leave, that he simply needed time to protect the business before any separation could occur. Yolanda admitted with visible shame that she had believed him, and had continued believing some version of that story for nearly 6 more years. Renata left that coffee shop with her anger redirected, but not diminished, understanding now that Yolanda had been deceived nearly as thoroughly as she had, though the two women's paths toward justice would inevitably diverge. Yolanda still held claim to the Savannah townhouse and the insurance policy Marcus had left her. Malik still held his ownership stake in Cole Freight Solutions, a stake that suddenly felt less like inheritance and more like leverage Renata would need to confront directly if she intended to protect the company bearing her husband's name, a company she had spent 18 years helping to build with her own labor, her own sacrifice, and her own quiet endurance. The battle ahead would not simply be emotional. It would be fought in boardrooms, in legal filings, and in a courtroom that would ultimately decide who truly owned what remained of Marcus Cole's legacy. In the weeks that followed, Renata found herself surprised by how frequently her thoughts turned not to Marcus, but to Malik, a 16-year-old boy who had lost a father he barely got to keep, who was now being publicly discussed in legal documents as though he were a line item rather than a grieving child. She recognized, with some discomfort, that her anger toward Marcus had nowhere left to land now that he was gone, and that redirecting it toward his son would accomplish nothing beyond making an already painful situation crueler for everyone involved. This recognition did not soften her resolve to protect the company she had built. It simply clarified, for the first time since the funeral, exactly who her fight was actually with, and it was not the teenager sitting 3 chairs away in a lawyer's office. The weeks following Renata's meeting with Yolanda were consumed by lawyers, ledgers, and the slow, grinding process of untangling a company that suddenly felt like a stranger's inheritance rather than her own life's work. Renata hired an attorney named Gregory Ashford, a sharp, methodical man who had handled business disputes across Charlotte for over 20 years, and together they began combing through every document tied to Cole Freight Solutions. What emerged was a picture far more complicated than a simple ownership transfer. Marcus had structured Malik's 22% stake, with voting rights attached to specific board decisions, meaning that any major move Renata wanted to make, expanding routes, refinancing debt, even replacing senior staff, would require sign-off from a 16-year-old boy represented by his mother's own newly hired attorney. The company Renata had helped build now stood at the mercy of decisions made by people she had known for barely a month. Gregory warned Renata early that a courtroom battle over the will itself would likely fail. Marcus had followed proper legal procedure when transferring the shares, notarized documents, witness signatures, nothing sloppy enough to challenge on technical grounds. Instead, Gregory proposed a different strategy, one rooted in the operating agreement Renata and Marcus had signed together when the company was first incorporated 18 years earlier. Buried in that original agreement, largely forgotten by everyone except the accountant Carla Simmons, was a clause requiring unanimous spousal consent for any transfer of ownership exceeding 15%, a clause Marcus himself had insisted on years earlier to protect the business from outside interference. Marcus, in his effort to secure Malik's future, had unknowingly violated the very safeguard he built to protect the company from exactly this kind of dispute. Gregory spent the better part of 2 weeks preparing the legal argument, cross-referencing the original incorporation documents against the later ownership transfer, building a case methodical enough to withstand scrutiny from Yolanda's attorney. He warned Renata that even with a strong legal position, a prolonged court battle could drag on for years, draining resources from the very company she was trying to protect, and could expose Malik to a level of public scrutiny that Renata, despite everything, found herself reluctant to inflict on a teenager who had done nothing wrong. Gregory suggested an alternative path, a private mediation that could resolve the dispute more quickly and with considerably less collateral damage, an option that would require both sides to negotiate in good faith rather than escalate toward a courtroom neither woman particularly wanted to enter. The revelation set up a tense mediation session in Gregory's downtown office, Renata seated across from Yolanda and her attorney, the weight of two families' futures pressing down on a conference table between them. Renata expected hostility, expected Yolanda to fight for every inch of what Marcus had promised her son. Instead, Yolanda surprised her. She admitted, quietly and without prompting, that she had never wanted a stake in a business she knew nothing about, that Marcus had made the decision unilaterally, presenting it to her as a done deal rather than a choice. Yolanda's priority, she insisted, had always been Malik's stability, not corporate control. It was the first moment since the funeral that Renata saw Yolanda not as a rival, but as another woman who had spent over a decade managing the fallout of Marcus Cole's careful, selfish architecture. Over the following month, Gregory negotiated a settlement that reshaped the entire structure of the inheritance. Malik would retain the life insurance policy and the Savannah townhouse, securing his and Yolanda's financial stability without requiring their involvement in the company itself. In exchange, Malik's ownership stake in Cole Freight Solutions would convert into a structured financial payout over 10 years, generous enough to fund his future education and needs, but stripped of any voting power or operational control. Renata would retain full ownership and leadership of the company she had spent nearly 2 decades helping to build, free to run it without interference from a family she never knew existed until the day she buried her husband. The agreement was signed on a quiet Thursday afternoon, without headlines, without courtroom drama, simply 4 signatures and a long exhale. In the months following the settlement, Renata threw herself into rebuilding Cole Freight Solutions with a transparency the company had never truly had under Marcus, instituting new financial oversight procedures, bringing in an outside auditor to review every account on a quarterly basis, determined that no one would ever again be able to hide a second life inside her ledgers without her knowledge. She promoted Carla Simmons to a senior financial officer position, partly out of gratitude for her honesty during the investigation, partly out of a recognition that trust, once broken so thoroughly, had to be rebuilt through structure rather than blind faith. Employees who had known Marcus for years began to notice a shift in the company's culture, more open communication, fewer closed-door decisions, a workplace that increasingly reflected Renata's own values rather than the carefully compartmentalized instincts that had apparently defined her late husband's entire adult life. But the story's final twist arrived nearly a year later, when Carla Simmons, reviewing old financial records during a routine audit, discovered something Marcus had hidden even more carefully than his second family. A separate account, opened under a business alias, held nearly $300,000 Marcus had quietly diverted over the years, money that belonged to neither Renata nor Yolanda's household, money whose destination Carla could not immediately trace. Renata's investigation, this time conducted with the full resources of her legal team, eventually revealed the funds had been intended for a third property, a home in Atlanta that Marcus had begun purchasing under a false name only months before his death, suggesting an entirely separate life he was preparing to build, one that neither Renata nor Yolanda had ever known about, and one death alone had prevented him from ever completing. The discovery sent Renata back through Marcus's old travel records with fresh eyes, cross-referencing business trips she had once assumed were entirely devoted to Savannah, and finding, buried among them, unexplained gaps of a day or 2 here and there that no longer fit neatly into either household's timeline. A hotel receipt from Atlanta, a parking garage charge near a neighborhood known for new residential development. A real estate agent's name that appeared exactly twice in 12 years of records, always paired with a cash withdrawal large enough to raise questions. Renata hired a private investigator, a quiet, thorough woman named Denise Okafor, to determine once and for all whether a third family existed somewhere in Atlanta, unaware that the man who had built their entire world around them was gone. Denise's investigation, which stretched across several weeks, ultimately found no evidence of a third woman, no additional children, no second Yolanda waiting to walk into another courtroom with another set of Marcus's unmistakable features. What she found instead was more unsettling in its own quiet way. Evidence that Marcus had been meeting with a real estate agent alone, touring the Atlanta property by himself on every recorded visit, making decisions about furnishings and floor plans that suggested not a family he intended to move in with someone, but a life he intended to build entirely apart from both households he already had, a private escape hatch from two lives that had each become, in their own way, more complicated than he could manage. Renata never fully learned who, if anyone, Marcus intended that Atlanta home for. The purchase was voided, the funds absorbed back into the estate, and Renata used a portion of that recovered money to establish a scholarship at the local community college in Marcus's name, a decision she made not out of forgiveness, but out of a determination to ensure something honest emerged from a life built so completely on concealment. Cole Freight Solutions continued to grow under her leadership, stronger and more transparent than it had ever been under Marcus. Yolanda and Malik moved forward quietly in Savannah, building a life free from the shadow of a man who had spent years balancing two families like ledgers. Never once imagining either woman would eventually uncover the truth without him there to explain it, Renata and Yolanda spoke only occasionally in the years that followed, mostly brief updates exchanged around Malik's milestones, his graduation, his acceptance into college, moments that Renata found herself genuinely happy to hear about despite everything. She never developed anything resembling friendship with Yolanda. The wound between them remained too deep for that, but she came to understand that both of them had been navigating the same carefully constructed deception from opposite sides of a wall Marcus had spent over a decade maintaining. What began as a story of humiliation and betrayal in a funeral home eventually became, for Renata, a story about the specific kind of strength required to rebuild a life and a business from the wreckage of a marriage that had never been entirely real, and about the quiet dignity of choosing transparency after inheriting nothing but secrets. Would you have forgiven Marcus, or spent the rest of your life uncovering every secret he left behind? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life inspired tales of betrayal, justice, and resilience. Let us know in the comments section where you are watching from, and if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you are subscribed so you never miss the next real story of betrayal, justice, and the families they leave behind.